Today we're going back to our roots and revisiting the very first topic I ever covered. For many, this may be a refresher course, while for others, hello and welcome. We're going to learn about my preferred method for fantasy world building, and that's to build it from the top down. I'm author DC Fergerson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, check this bad boy out. I just released book 6 of the Dragon's Dream saga, Fated Alliance. It's available in ebook, paperback, and totally free to read on Kindle Unlimited. Stay tuned at the end too, because you're going to get a preview of the first chapter of book 7 as well. Full of action, twists, turns, and the wild world where magic and technology are at odds with each other. Get the latest tale in the Dragon's Dream saga on Amazon now. So, why are we building a world from the top down? Well, whether you're planning on using the fantasy world you create for storytelling and writing or film, tabletop gaming, or video game design, we want to have a cohesive world that feels interconnected even if the parts that make it up are very, very different. The problem with making up a world as you go, or pantsing as some authors call it, is that there are a significantly higher number of pitfalls and the potential for continuity errors that'll creep in. On the other end of the scale, if you're too cautious in trying to avoid these pitfalls, you might just end up with a world that feels the same no matter how far you travel. Believe me, that is just as bad. If I told you to go to sleep in your home city and tomorrow you'd wake up in Hong Kong, but nothing would feel different, you'd have some serious questions for me. If everyone is speaking the same language, cities are laid out the same way, the laws are what you already understand, the system of government works the same, and the culture and cuisine of the people doesn't change, you'd doubt you've gone anywhere at all. This kind of silliness is particularly evident in one of my favorite cyberpunk films, Johnny Mnemonic, starring Keanu Reeves. Despite multiple changes in locale throughout the film, the movie's tonal style never shifts away from this cramped, dirty, place that's filled with electronics and does future stuff. Even our street doctor, who owns his own workshop, has given himself this cramped space to work in with stuff lying everywhere and no desire to have even one room that he keeps immaculate and sterile. I said this movie was a favorite. I didn't say it was well done. So prepare for me to return to this as a bad example a few times. Another thing to keep in mind is the big picture aspect. If you construct where the story takes place and then build out from there, you're always looking over your shoulder to check against contradictions with what you've already crafted. For example, let's say that we wanted to craft a fantasy tale inspired by the American Revolution. If we start from our lead character being an upstanding British citizen living in the colonies, and then we have our inciting incident, our hero joins in the fantasy equivalent of the Boston Tea Party, and then fights the evil oppressive king. By the time we get to England, we've made the king entirely evil, and our hero entirely good. People in the colonies that don't want a revolution are now evil or cowards, and no matter what means our hero uses to accomplish their ends, it's good and justified. And what you end up with is The Patriot, a film that went so hard into the concept that they made the entire war black and white. American revolutionaries were wholly good, loyalists were evil cowards, and the British were megalomaniacal tyrants that killed women and children to prove a point. It's so comically separated from reality that not only is your story drained of all nuance, but so is your world. So, let's avoid that and get started with a map. So, we want a map of our world. Start with the important region where your story will take place, and then build out from there. But DC, I suck at making maps. Well, guy who talks to your monitor, fear not. If you'd like to build your own, I have this handy video right here on important stuff that we all forgot from environmental science class to refresh you. Or you could just use a map generator. There are plenty of those too, and some of them are really neat. Either way, I don't care if you took cartography and drew up a map accurate to a quarter-mile scale, or you made land masses on a napkin with crayons. If you've got a map, let's get started. In the beginning, a lot like a Bob Ross video, we want to just lay down some color and feel out the canvas a little. So let's pepper in our important nations, kingdoms, regions, or solar systems if you're a dirty little sci-fi boy like me. From there, at this layer, you can start putting in whatever you feel is going to be relevant to the story. I'm a big planner, so this is the part where I'd start working on my religion and politics for each region. I'd also start with my culture and society, and my fantasy creatures if I had any. Using the Bob Ross example, what we're doing now is defining the sky, the ground, some mountains, water. We're defining the shape and parameters of our world here. The big picture hasn't quite taken hold, but now you can see where you're going. Next up, we're going to put in our major players. Now, major players isn't a term that I talk about too often, because it's really mostly important in the planning phases like this. When I say major players, I'm talking about who runs the show in this region. It's only important uniquely for you and your story. After all, if your character crosses through the wilds of a kingdom and never actually interacts with anyone there, then it's not important to know too much about them. However, if you're planning on a character running afoul of the town guard and then being taken before the local lord, you're probably going to want to know a whole lot about the laws, the town guard themselves, and of course the major player of the local lord. Because this is a major player, consider them a sort of tastemaker for the region. How he behaves and the laws he creates and enforces dictate how the people in this town live. If he's a total jerk and people hate him, perhaps your hero is getting busted out of the dungeon by local revolutionaries. If he's a man of his people and equally untrusting of outsiders, perhaps they're in a rush to get our hero exiled out of town. Now, we're going to stop there with the nuts and bolts of your regions, and there's a crucial reason why. The next step we take is going to change the world. Invariably, whether we're going to be using magic, technology, or both, your fantasy or sci-fi world is going to have some of it in there. Now, if you're asking how do you create these systems, I'm so glad you asked, because we've gone to exhaustive depth in these videos that I'm going to link right here. What we're going to talk about here, though, isn't about the creation of those systems. You're a storyteller, a kind of inventor all to yourself, and I trust you're going to make something awesome. What I need you to do next, though, is ask your new societies and their major players how they feel about that. If you're following the path I've been taking you on, then you've already got a pretty good feel for what these towns, kingdoms, or worlds are like. You know your major players, or at least you know of them. That is to say that you know as much as someone in your world would tell you about them. So, what do these major players think of this power and technology? Has it been around for very long? What is the region's history with it? Are there many users of it in this area? Now, there's again a really good reason why we want to do this at this stage. The amount of realistic and organic reaction we get to the powers of our world, the more immersive it becomes with our audience. If we're in a world where magic is very commonplace, then when a housewife puts a self-sweeping broom on her porch and lets it go to work while she makes dinner, no one is going to bat an eye. That's tone and tempo. An example like that sets the tone for how your audience should feel about magic in this world. It also creates suspension of disbelief. Let's look at another example right back to Johnny Mnemonic where this failed. Some of you already know darn well what I'm about to say. In this scene in Johnny Mnemonic, Johnny is hanging out with some hacktivists, a group that's bent on getting the truth out to the people. Their greatest hacker, and Johnny's only hope for extracting the data in his head, is Jones. Only, Jones is a friggin' dolphin. Now, not only are we as an audience surprised and super confused by this fact, but so is Johnny. And therein lies the biggest problem. If our narrative had given a clue, even a comment, that dolphins are some of the world's greatest hackers, then okay, sure, maybe I can buy it when I see it later on. If Johnny walked into the room and was like, Jones is a dolphin, I knew it, then we're like, okay, I guess that's normal here. But for it to be as weird to him as it is to us starts making us ask all kinds of questions. Where did this group get the dolphin? Who is the guy that said, let's hook up this dolphin to a computer and see if he wants to learn how to hack? Most importantly, isn't keeping Jones in a tiny cage of dirty brown water some form of animal abuse? It's so important to understand not only how your world works, but how the people in it think and feel about it. If there's one thing you learned in the last section, it's that black and white absolutes are bad. Shades of gray always feel more realistic and more developed. No offense to our fairy godmothers, of course, but leave black and white absolutes for fairy tales. They actually work very well there. So, now our magic and technology system is created, employed, and we know how everyone feels about it. So, let's go down to our next, final level. The last thing that we want to touch on is something that should never be overlooked. A living, breathing world gets that way when it immerses our audience in the setting. Nothing does that quite like tradition. The history of your world can be as developed as you need it to be. Remember, at the end of the day, we're still serving a story. So yes, feel free to create your own Tolkien-style fantasy language if you're so inclined. And yes, write out a timeline of major events throughout your world's history. Eventually, though, you'll need to tell a tale that's both engaging and focused. The truth of that is that your audience will likely see only a fraction of what you've created, even if you create a series of incredibly large fantasy books. For example, when my series, The Dragon's Dream Saga, comes to an end with Book 8 later this year, you will have seen exactly the history and culture of the world I've created as it was relevant to the world I've made. Honestly, that's something like 10 to 20% of the work I put in. And this world is based off of 2082 Earth. For a fully brand new world, such as Newland in the Wicked Instruments series, you see even less of the work I put in. Some places, events, and history of your world just won't make it to the page or screen, but that's okay. I still suggest you put the work in anyway. The reason for this is simple. You're betting against your own design space. When our hero walks into a tavern and has a conversation with one of the locals, we know things that may be on their mind because we know the politics and region of the area. We know how they'll behave based on the culture and the laws, and we know what they're made of by the traditions they stand upon from their history. It makes each character, no matter how insignificant, a product of their place and time in the story and gives them a unique voice. It's not only infinitely easier to write them this way, but again, doesn't require what I call a speed bump effect in writing. This is where you're chugging along, the words are coming like water, and then you get to a part where you need to meet this person in your world, and suddenly you need a name. Well, that's easy. Let's go hit up a name generator, or we're going to look up some baby names for something with meaning. We need to feel out who they are real quick. Maybe they have a sword, but it's from another region. Crap, what were the swords that were used in Bronze Era Northern Africa? I wanted to match the times, but I wanted to feel foreign. Now I gotta figure out what his accent sounds like. Before you know it, you're sitting down to resume this conversation with this new character, and an hour has passed doing research with stops to check your Facebook and Twitter in between. If all that sounded familiar, it's not just you. Believe me, all writers get ADHD when they're writing, even if they didn't already have it. So, that was the scenic route to say this. Understanding your world's history can be as important to your plot as, say, the previous off-screen war with the Mad King in Game of Thrones, which would be highly relevant and pervasive in the narrative, or completely ignored, like everything that ever happened to the world in Mad Max's Post-Apocalypse. If you've gotten this far, though, congratulations. You've just made your first world from the top down. Like a Bob Ross painting, I want you to step back and take it in. Look at the beautiful little trees. It's perfect imperfections. And, like the poster above my desk says, no mistakes, only happy accidents. Creating a world is a daunting task of crafting. In some cases, it can feel like the biggest chore before writing, but I say no. Embrace it. You get to set the tone for the way an entire world works that will best serve the story you want to tell. There is no greater feeling than stepping back from what you've made, that excitement just before the pen hits the paper, and you create a character that lives and walks around in what you've made. That's when you've given life to something, and few things in this world can match that feeling. Once again, the donations from you guys are so awesome, and I thank you so much. We're still working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this beautiful lady a service dog. Her name is Liana. She's 11 and on the spectrum. This wonderful person is my little girl, and if you'd like to help out, there's a link in the comments below. Also, while you're down there, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. you're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on in books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Fergerson. Now have fun and get crafting.